Thank you very much. I'd like to thank, first of all, Menno van Doorn for inviting me and Sujetti and so many of you to come here. You may wonder, God, why do we now have to waste 30 minutes on history? It's all in the past. As a historian, I do believe that we carry this history with us like a rucksack on our shoulders. Many of you will be concerned with the material baggage that we carry with us, but I'd like to show you in the next 20 minutes or so also a little bit about the cultural baggage, the way we've come to live and look at consumption the way we do. And as I'm in the Netherlands, I'm particularly pleased because the American and German edition chose for their cover a piece of an artwork by a living Dutch artist, Richard Kuper. You can see it looks at first sight like a 17th century still life, a genre we call the memento mori or vanitas paintings, where in the 17th century people used things, objects that appear just dead, left over, without human beings, to make us reflect on just how short our time on this planet is. And Richard Kuper updated this by creating plasticized version with objects of our own times, like the beach ball, or to the left you can see some video cassettes. So this talk of mine is a little bit to make us think, how did we get to where we are now? And to start with, I want to take you into the late 19th century and to a very eminent thinker, William James, a pragmatist philosopher, but also the founding father of psychology. He's the older brother of Henry James. Many of you will have come across Henry James, the novelist. Many movies made out of Hollywood with Henry James novels. But William James the older was pondering the question of identity. What is it actually when we talk about identity and when we talk of ourself? What is that made up of? And he looked back to ancient philosophers and said, no, of course we know there's something called a private self. We all have in our heads and in our bones a sense of who we are, just we as individuals. But then we have a social self, so we don't think of ourselves in isolation from other human beings. Our parents, our siblings, our children, our friends, our neighbors, whether they're nice or not so nice, they're also part somehow of our social self. And that was well known at the time William James wrote in the 1880s, early 1890s. But then James said something's missing. People have not properly realized. And that is what James called a material self. And he defines it in this short passage where he says, you know, a person's self is that everything they can call his or her own, the possessions. So he lists them. The clothes we have, the house, a yacht, land, horses. If you translate that into our times, you know, house, whether you have one or not, a car or a bicycle, could be a vintage car in your garage, your favorite suit or shoes, a wristwatch. When you get up and you go to work, you think something's missing. I'm not myself. I need to find my wristwatch. All those things. And he argued these are not just possessions, but in our lives and in our minds, they become part of who we are or who we want to be or who we want others to think we are. And there are good reasons why he concluded that, because at the time you have the Gilded Age, as people at the time called it in America, so massive expansion of the economy, a rise in the standard of living, a proliferation of consumer goods, things that people bought rather than made for themselves. But the point applies to our own times as well. Any of you who will have elderly parents who had to move out of their house because they needed to be in a care home, it's a traumatic experience. Things, all the possessions, the armchair where one always sat, or the row of pictures, all the presents and gifts the grandchildren had made over the years. You can't take all of them into the care home, so you have to sift through it. And it's a painful experience for many people because they feel they're shedding part of their identity. And so a little exercise for all of you is to imagine that at the end of the day, this very interesting day, you're all stimulated and you're walking happily back to your home. You come around the corner and you see the whole block of houses is up in flames. And no fire engine. Everything's destroyed. Now, if I come to you and say, don't worry, I know you have home insurance, they pay for it. You say, well, that's nice, but what about the gold ring that I inherited from my great aunt? Or, no, there was this picture my 5-year-old made in school of a dog. It looked more like a bear. You know, those are things that you can't simply buy on the market and replace, and you would feel that something of your life has gone. We know from history just that, how dramatic or tragic the effect can be. After 1945, in Germany, you have compensation laws for the victims of Nazi tyranny. Most of those are German Jews who lost everything. Their children, their survivors, often are in court for decades, not about the amount of money they want, but very particular items. So one thing that sticks in my mind from the archives is a woman who battled in the courts for 15 years with a German family who had helped her parents before they were deported to Auschwitz, and who received in return a simple painting. And in the court, the German family is really upset about this. They say, well, we got this as a thank you from the parents. And they say, it's not even oil. It's not worth anything, really, on the art market. But for the daughter, this painting, in a way, carried the spirit of her parents. And it was not about the price tag. So things really play an important role in our lives, and James is interesting not just because he recognizes this, he gives it a positive value. He recognizes that things allow us to develop our personality over life, and in a way, if you take this forward to our own times, it's also a recognition that we can modulate and manipulate our personality. We can enrich it or cultivate it by changing material lifestyles. Yeah, so in next year, you may decide this leather jacket, that was me. That was really who I was. But now, I feel slightly different. So I want a different jacket or a different hairstyle. Different shoes, different interior, new wallpaper. All of these things help us to evolve as an individual. Now, it wasn't always like that. And if you go back a few hundred years to the late 15th century to Florence, in 1497, the burghers of this rich Renaissance city were called on by an enthusiastic, hot-headed Dominican preacher, Savonarola, to bring out of their flats and houses all their precious possessions: oriental carpets, fine paintings, musical instruments, silk dresses, books, fine books, other luxury articles, and they were piled up in the Piazza of the Signoria, and then put on fire, so-called bonfire of the vanities. And if you didn't participate, you were not a good citizen. So you're encouraged to do this to show you're a virtuous citizen who is not entrapped by objects or possessions. Now, to us, this is almost unimaginable. I do not know of a single, even not a single green politician anywhere in Europe who says the way to deal with the climate crisis is to have another bonfire of the vanities. Please bring your Ferraris, Porsches, VWs, and we just blow them up in the town square. That wouldn't be, I mean, you wouldn't get many votes for that. And not just from the rich, we also know from survey data and other research that all across society, the idea that an authority interferes with your lifestyle, how you want to live, by asking you to just give up possessions or take them away, that's just not on. The only luxury laws that are surviving to the present are in Italy, and they specifically only include yachts over a certain length of meters. So, I don't know, up to 12 meters, you're fine. If you're over 12 meters, you have a special luxury tax. But that's about it. You do not pay special luxury taxes because your wristwatch is 50,000, 100,000, or 200,000 euros worth. Now, at the time, this is sort of a dramatic measure, but it's completely in line with the dominant worldview that rules across Europe and what we now call the developed world. And the idea goes back to the ancients, to Plato, and to the Christian fathers, and it's very simple. The idea is there is a human self, the mind, the soul, and ideally we want to keep this as pure as possible. And then there's a world of things, and they lead to temptations, and they try to entrap you. And so whether you're Christian or just an aesthetic philosopher, the idea was you should try to keep the world of things at bay, limit your consumption, punish others who do not limit their consumption, and try to pursue a virtuous path to keep your soul as pure as possible, and ideally, if you give any luxury objects, give them to church. That's to honor God, not for self-satisfaction. Now, this dominant ideal, which contrasts things and the human soul, comes under attack in the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. William James is a kind of high point of that new way of thinking. And how did that happen? I brought along, or I'm showing you, a few of the key objects which started to excite people in the Netherlands, in England, and then more broadly in Europe and also across the Atlantic. You can see in the top right the typical vessel which Europeans drank from, a stoneware bottle from the Rhineland. You can see a sort of a very rough attempt at branding. Someone tried to put the blue stamp on there, but you see it's a very rough thing. And I bet you, if I offered you the choice of the porcelain bottle right next to it with the shiny, glazed painting on top of it, light, which can hold hot liquid without cracking, unlike our stoneware bottle, you would go for the Chinese porcelain, as many Europeans started to want. At the bottom, you have a Wedgwood, so-called jasperware teapot. Europeans could not rival the technological finesse and brilliance of Chinese producers, so the best Wedgwood was able to come up with was this alternative look-alike version, jasperware. And then you have from across the Atlantic, from the Latin America, you have a silver Marchi teapot. Now, what holds all these objects together, it's that it's about social consumption, sociability. When we read about, especially from critics of consumption, often it looks like, well, the typical consumer we want to get away from is selfish, egotistical, materialist, just wants to enrich their own lives. But actually, when consumption expanded, it was social in the first place. So you could have a tea party. Or with a marchi cup, you can see the bombilla, the straw. That exists because it was shared. It was passed around a group of people. So instead of going to the pub, you would have a marchi tea party. And if you think a little bit further, if you want to have new forms of sociability and get together and social exchange, well, you can't just have a teapot and some cups. Ideally, you want to sit comfortably. So you have the upholstered armchair emerging in Europe. And you don't want it to be cold in your house. So you get nice carpets and you get curtains. People didn't used to have curtains. Then you want to have wallpaper to look at, and you want to change that to be fashionable. So all these sort of items come with some knock-on effects of more and more and more items that make you more comfortable and allow greater sociability. Now, Chinese porcelain and also Indian tea and other exotic goods like tobacco, cocoa, and coffee are intimately tied to the expansion of the colonial empires in the 16th to 18th century. So that is really a major story in this. This is not a peaceful story. It's about imperial expansion and extraction and slave plantations. But on top of this economic base, you now get social, cultural, and the political defense of consumer culture. And the elements are relatively straightforward. One is Dutch. So an eminent scholar and merchant, Caspar Berlioz, in 1630, addressed the burghers of Amsterdam in the Athenaeum to tell them about the importance of commerce and the trade in objects. He said, we need to be outward looking. The world is full of unidentified materials, minerals, vegetables, other objects, and they're out there for a purpose. We're invited to reach out to them, and you really become only a true human if you expand your horizon like that. So the law of things isn't just that it's temptation, it also science, curiosity, connecting with other parts of the world. In England, David Hume started to defend luxury. He said all these people who always want to crack down on luxury and punish people or throw them in prison for wearing a fashionable good, they're wrong-headed. He said luxury, as long as it's in moderate forms, actually allows self-cultivation. He calls it the refinement of the senses. Yeah, your senses will be different if you're surrounded by fine paintings than if you just have gray cement walls. If you go to theaters, museums, restaurants, meet with other people in cities, what people used to call civilization. And then you have Adam Smith a few years later in 1776 arguing in The Wealth of Nations that consumption is the sole end of all production, turning old wisdom upside down. He said, actually, ultimately, what's produced is produced because there is demand for it. So let's not put down consumption, see it as something that actually is dynamic and active. And then in politics, you have arguments that everyone's a consumer. We're all consumers. It unites us as humans. Doesn't matter whether you support Ajax or Rotterdam or so, we're all consumers. The public interest, and people started to talk about the citizen consumer. By 1900s, it's long before New Labour also. So suddenly consumption is something positive that's being encouraged and invited. Now, let me, this is the optimism now comes to an end a little bit, because it leaves behind problems. I mentioned the exotic goods. Their value derived from distance. Only small number of scholars or very risk-taking merchants had managed to go out to the coastal ports in China or India. And the goods that they brought back had value because all of us had never been to these places. But this changes in the late 19th century as mass consumption and industrial forms of processing take over. And I've brought some examples from advertising from the decades before the First World War, where suddenly the exotic distance loses its value, and these exotic goods become rebranded as national goods. And so to give you an example here, the Sailor, that's Cadbury, the big British cocoa and chocolate manufacturer, the advertisement says, keeps me strong, the good old English cocoa. You have the Paula girl in Finland in Finnish sack-smacky costume presenting Finnish coffee. Those of you who've been to Finland will realize it's not where you find cocoa plantations. Many lakes, but no cocoa plantations. The German national hero, Arminius, who beat the Romans, not that far from here, in the Teutoburg forest, just after birth of Christ. Again, oak trees, not coffee plantation. And then you have Jeanne d'Arc chocolate in France. And this is in a way where we are now, still, where our knowledge of the objects and the things which used to be appreciated and give them value have increasingly been diminished. Most of our stuff is made in so many different places we no longer know. And if you try and find out, it's quickly frustrating. So that's one problem we have, this disconnection. We have lots of stuff, but actually we're pretty illiterate and ignorant about the things which we used to treasure. The second problem is, is the welfare state. Many people argue that really it's inequality which is driving consumption. We all want to be like the Kardashians. I'm not sure that is actually true, and if I look around, I don't see many Kardashian lookalikes, which may be a good thing. If you look at the history of the last 50, 70 years, the big boom in consumption, 1950s to mid-1970s, is the period when European societies were more equal than ever before. And the welfare state has a lot to do with our high level of consumption, because the welfare state redistributes wealth and effectively lifts poorer, more vulnerable sections onto the stage of consumption. The third big problem is technology. Yes, in the last century we've had massive productivity gains, but our hunger for materials and objects has been even higher. So if you look at the material footprint on the world, it's gone up, it's become bigger, even though we produce much more efficiently. Some people put their faith in new technologies to get us out of the crisis. If this picture is anything to go by, I think good luck. You know, new digital technologies are maybe wonderful, but they are still heavy in terms of material consumption. We just don't see it because it ends up in China. Now, should we despair? Is there anything we can do? Can a historian perhaps come back to a little bit of optimism? I think yes, actually. And so I want to end really with 2 points which are represented in these pictures. The first is this teenage room on the left side from 1960 West Germany. When we talk about consumption, particularly in a commercial setting or with companies, many very, very quickly fall into the trap that they think in terms of individual and choice, that's the driver. And that's true in the supermarket, and in a department store, but there's a world of consumption which doesn't operate to that logic. A lot of consumption concerns social norms and habits. So there's a kind of normal assumption about how our consumption should look like, which operates in the background through things like infrastructures, heating. And this is the example. This, in Europe, until the 50s, children slept in their rooms. They were unheated. They were for sleeping only. Social investigators who asked mothers, working-class mothers, so what do your children do? They look, what do you mean? They sleep. It's a cold room. And then in the morning, they get up and they leave the bedroom, and they sit in the living room or kitchen where it's warm. That's how it is. Well, the minute radiators move into bedrooms, like this one, you have a teenage bonanza. You can have a party. You can have your friends over. You could have, ultimately, your own second or third television set in that room. There are new habits and lifestyles that are forming around that. So how that normality is established is really important, or as important as thinking about how we can manipulate individual choice. And societies in the past have done so. That's my second picture. From Japan, from the 1920s, Japan had a massive campaign to transform everyday life, to transform the way the kitchen is designed, living rooms, how people spend time with the family at home. And this was an initiative which had the support of the state, architects, and women's movements. And the idea was, we must live differently. We can imagine a lifestyle that will be really different from the way it is now, and that's a good thing. And so I think there's some lessons there, because we sometimes become a little bit lazy and say, well, we're just stuck, you know. The future, we want the future as if we just want to hold on to the present, just make it more efficient or profitable. But that's not the only way to think about the future. So in the past, people really tried to imagine a different material culture, poured resources into it, and if you go to Japan now, and I give you a time travel machine to go back to 1900, you would be amazed of how their daily style of consumption changed. And so history is a baggage, but we're not slaves of it. We can carry that baggage into different directions if we want to. Thank you.